Close your eyes. Now strip away every flicker of light you've ever known. No street lamps bleeding through the curtains, no blue glow from a smartphone, no hum of a refrigerator. In the year 1350, when the sun dips below the horizon of a small English village, the world doesn't just get dark, it vanishes. For a medieval woman, this isn't a temporary inconvenience. It is the arrival of a physical weight. The great silence descends, and with it, a primal fear that your modern mind can barely grasp. Out there, in the void beyond the cottage door, the line between the natural and the supernatural dissolves. This is where her true day begins. A secret, shadow-bound life of survival, superstition, and a silent battle against the cold. The transition was violent. One moment, the sky is a bruised purple over the thatched roofs, and the next, you are blind. If you are a peasant woman named Alice, your world has just shrunk to the 3 or 4 feet, illuminated by the dying embers of your hearth. To step outside now is to gamble with your soul. The night belonged to the wolves, both the 4-legged kind and the ones people whispered about in the village square. The church taught that the darkness was the devil's playground, a time when nightwalkers and spirits of the unbaptized roamed the muddy lanes. Every creak of the timber, every rustle in the thatch wasn't just the wind, it was a potential curse. Imagine the psychological toll. Your entire sensory world is reduced to sound and touch. You navigate your home by memory, your fingers tracing the rough-hewn stone and the cold dirt floor. You are a prisoner of the sun, and the ransom is fire. But fire is expensive, fire is dangerous, and fire is a luxury you cannot afford to waste. In the 14th century, the night was governed by the curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When the parish bell tolled, it wasn't just a suggestion to go to sleep, it was a law of survival. The authorities feared fire more than the plague. A single spark in a village of wood and straw could erase 100 lives by dawn. So, as the bell echoes through the damp evening air, Alice must perform a ritual that has remained unchanged for centuries. She isn't just turning in, she is banking the fire, burying the hot coals under a layer of ash to keep them breathing until morning. If she fails, her family wakes up in a tomb of ice. If she succeeds, she preserves the heartbeat of the home. But the night isn't just about sleep. It is a time of intense, quiet labor. While her husband snores on a pallet of straw, Alice is still awake. Her eyes have adjusted to the gloom, a night vision born of necessity. She listens. She listens for the breath of her children to ensure the damp hasn't claimed their lungs. She listens for the stirrings of the livestock, often kept in the same room to share their body heat. The smell of wet wool, manure, and smoke is the perfume of her existence. There is an eerie, beautiful paradox here. In this absolute darkness, the medieval woman found a strange kind of autonomy. The prying eyes of the priest, the village elders, and the manor lord were gone. In the shadows of the cottage, stories were whispered, tales of old gods that the church tried to bury, recipes for tinctures that could soothe a fever or end an unwanted burden. The night was a sanctuary for the old ways. As we journey through these 15 chapters of the medieval night, we will uncover the chemical secrets of her kitchen, the brutal reality of her bed, and the terrifying superstitions that kept her heart racing until the first gray light of dawn. We are stepping into the Vale of Shadows, a place where history isn't written in ink, but in the flicker of a tallow candle and the grit of a woman who refused to let the darkness win. But before we look at what she did in the dark, we must understand the one thing she feared losing more than her life: the fire. Because in 1350, the hearth wasn't just a stove. It was the only thing standing between your family and the hungry mouth of the abyss. In our modern world, comfort is invisible. We walk to a wall, flick a plastic dial, and the air magically warms to a precise 72 degrees. We don't think about the gas lines, the electricity, or the mechanics. But for the woman of 1350, comfort was a living, breathing creature that had to be fed, tamed, and guarded. It was the hearth, and she was its absolute master. To understand the medieval evening, you have to understand that the hearth was the sun around which the domestic universe orbited. It wasn't just a place to cook. It was the only source of light, the only defense against the damp chill that seeped through stone walls, and the only thing keeping the wolves of winter at bay. The evening began with a high-stakes game of chemistry. As the village bell, the couvre-feu, tolled across the dark fields, the medieval woman had to perform the most critical task of her day. She didn't turn off the fire. She banked it. This wasn't as simple as letting the wood burn out. If she let the fire die completely, the morning would be a disaster. Lighting a fire from scratch in the 14th century was a grueling process involving flint, steel, and charred linen that could take 30 minutes of shivering frustration. Instead, she used a curfew, a large bell-shaped metal cover, or simply a thick layer of ash to bury the glowing embers. She had to strike a perfect balance, cover the coals too tightly, and the fire would suffocate, leaving her with cold black coal in the morning. Leave too much air, and the fuel would burn away before midnight, leaving the house a frozen tomb by 3 a.m. This was an inherited science, passed from mother to daughter like a sacred hymn. She knew the breath of the coals. She knew how much ash to pile based on the humidity in the air or the strength of the wind howling down the smoke hole. But where did that heat come from? In the 21st century, we complain about our energy bills. In the 14th century, a woman paid for her heat in sweat and bone-deep fatigue. Depending on where she lived in Europe, the fuel changed, but the labor remained constant. In the wooded areas of France or Germany, she spent her twilight hours hauling deadwood or branches. In the peat bogs of Ireland or the English fens, she dealt with turf, dense, wet blocks of decayed vegetation that had to be dried for months. Peat was a fickle fuel. It produced a thick, sweet-smelling smoke that clung to your clothes and hair for life, but it burned slow and steady. A peasant woman knew the personality of every log. Oak for a long, hot night, birch for a quick, bright flame, green wood that hissed and spat, filling the room with blinding smoke. She was a master of resource management. Fuel was gold. To burn too much on a mildly cold night was a sin of waste that could mean starvation in February. Every stick was calculated. Let's pause for a moment and talk about the atmosphere of this medieval evening. You might imagine a cozy, romantic fireplace. The reality was much grittier. Most peasant cottages didn't have chimneys. Instead, they had a smoke hole, a simple gap in the thatched roof. The fire sat in the center of the room on a raised stone hearth. As the woman worked in the evening, the air she breathed was thick with particulate matter. Modern studies on reconstructed medieval houses show that the air quality was often worse than the most polluted cities on Earth today. A woman's eyes were perpetually red and stinging. Her lungs were under constant assault. Chronic bronchitis and hearth lung were the silent companions of the medieval housewife. When she leaned over the pot to stir the evening pottage, she was navigating a fog of gray soot. This is the part the fairy tales leave out: the smell of burning peat, the film of ash on every surface, and the constant hacking cough that echoed through the dark. Because the hearth was so central to survival, it naturally became the center of her spiritual world. The medieval woman wasn't just a cook, she was a sort of hearth witch, though the church wouldn't like that term. The fire was seen as a barrier between the holy home and the chaotic spirits of the night. As she banked the fire, she often whispered a blessing or made the sign of the cross in the ashes. There were superstitions for every spark. If a coal popped loudly, it was a stranger coming to visit. If the flames burned blue, a spirit was in the room. She watched the patterns of the soot on the backstone. Some said they could see the faces of the dead or the omens of the coming harvest. The fire was her oracle. Stop for a second. Think about your evening tonight. You might complain that your room is a bit drafty. You might adjust your smart home app from your bed. Now, look at this woman in 1350. She is kneeling in the dirt, her hands stained gray with ash, her lungs burning, guarding a handful of orange embers as if they were the lifeblood of her children, which they were. We have lost the intimacy of the fire. We have gained convenience, yes, but we have lost the ritual of the master of the hearth. For her, the fire wasn't a utility. It was a companion. It was the only thing that made the great silence bearable. It was the heartbeat of the house, and she was the only one who knew how to keep that heart beating. As she finishes burying the embers, her work is still far from over. The fire is tamed, but the darkness is hungry. Now she must turn to the other sources of light, the expensive, flickering, and often foul-smelling candles and lamps that will allow her to continue her labor into the deep night. Imagine your vision is failing, not because of age, but because the very air around you is thick with a greasy, yellow haze. To be a woman in a medieval evening was to exist in a permanent state of squinting. Once the hearth fire was banked into a low, orange glow, any further light had to be bought with blood, fat, and bone. In the year 1350, light wasn't clean. It wasn't a flicker of a switch. It was a spluttering, stinking struggle against the void. And if you were poor, which almost everyone was, your light didn't come from a beautiful wax candle. It came from the rushlight. If you walked into a peasant cottage in the English Midlands or the French countryside after sunset, the first thing that would hit you wasn't the darkness. It was the smell. It was the scent of rendered mutton fat, tallow, burning at a low, smoky temperature. For the medieval woman, the rushlight was her primary companion. Think of a long, thin meadow rush. During the late summer evenings, she would have spent hours gathering these, peeling away the outer green skin to reveal the white pith inside, leaving just one small strip to act as a spine. Then, in the evening, she would dip these dried sticks into a grisée, a long iron pan filled with the leftover fat from the kitchen. This was recycling at its most primal. Every bit of grease from a slaughtered pig or a roasted sheep was liquid gold. As she holds the rushlight in a simple iron clip, it burns for maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes of dim, flickering, smoky light before she has to reach for another. This was the battery life of the Middle Ages. You didn't just leave the light on. You managed it, second by second, as you tried to mend a tunic or stir a pot. Can you imagine trying to do high-stakes labor, like sewing a tear in your only winter cloak, by a light that is literally a piece of burning fat that could go out if you breathe too hard? For those who could afford slightly better, there were tallow candles. But don't let the word candle fool you into thinking of a modern, scented masterpiece. A tallow candle was essentially a stick of hard, smelly animal fat with a wick made of hemp or cotton. They were notorious. They guttered. They teared, meaning the hot fat ran down the side in thick, grotesque clumps. And the smell. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse that had caught fire. If you were a medieval woman, your hair, your skin, and your clothes were permanently infused with the scent of burning sheep fat. When you leaned over your work, the smoke from the tallow would sting your eyes until they watered, turning the room into a blurred, shifting world of shadows. This is why medieval art often looks so flat and stylized, because the people who made it were often looking through a veil of greasy smoke and dim yellow light. Now contrast this with the world of the nobility or the church. If you were a noblewoman in a stone castle or a nun in a wealthy convent, your evening smelled like honey. You had beeswax. Beeswax burned bright. It burned clean. It didn't smell like a frying pan. But the cost? One beeswax candle could cost more than a peasant's food for a week. This created a light divide that defined your social status. In the great halls of the elite, the evening was an extension of the day, brightened by dozens of expensive wax tapers. But for the woman in the cottage, the evening was a tactical battle. She lived in the soot zone. She was a creature of the tallow, her world limited to the tiny circle of yellow light provided by a spluttering rush. How did she know when to stop? How did she measure the night in a world without mechanical clocks? She used the light itself. This was the candle clock. She knew that a standard tallow candle burned down about an inch every 40 minutes. Some women would even insert small metal nails or weights into the side of the candle at specific intervals. As the flame reached the nail, it would fall onto a metal plate with a clink, the first snooze alarm in history. This clink told her it was time to check the bread, time to say her prayers, or time to finally, mercifully, put out the light and save the precious fat for tomorrow. Time wasn't an abstract number on a screen. It was a physical melting of fat. It was the sound of a nail hitting a dish in the dark. The limited light did something strange to the medieval mind. It made the world feel crowded. When your only light is a single flickering flame, the shadows on the wall aren't just shapes. They move. They stretch. To a woman whose head was filled with stories of wood sprites, boggarts, and demons, the flickering light turned her home into a theater of the supernatural. The corners of the room didn't just contain dust, they contained possibilities. Every time the tallow spluttered and the light dipped, her heart would skip. Was that the shadow of the loom, or was it something else? This constant visual strain, the combination of physical squinting and mental alertness, is a form of exhaustion we can't imagine. We live in a world of flat light, where everything is visible at once. She lived in a world of deep shadows, where you only saw what the fat allowed you to see. Think about your night shift today. Maybe you stay up late working on a laptop, your face bathed in the clean, sterile blue light of a screen. You might feel tired, but you don't feel dirty. Now, look at the medieval woman. She is working a night shift that never ends. She is covered in a fine layer of soot. Her eyes are red-rimmed. She's breathing in the fumes of a dead sheep, and she is doing it all to save a few pennies worth of fat so her children can have a hot meal in the morning. Her evening isn't vibey or cozy. It's a gritty, smelly, high-stakes endurance test. As she blows out her final rushlight, The darkness rushes back in like a flood, but the hunger doesn't go away. In the absolute blackness that follows, she must navigate the most dangerous part of her evening, the kitchen. Because in the Middle Ages, what you ate in the dark was just as important as how you saw it. It's 11 p.m. Your stomach growls. In the 21st century, you perform a ritual so common you don't even think about it. The midnight fridge raid. You walk to the kitchen, pull a handle, and a pristine white light bathes your face. You choose between chilled grapes, a leftover slice of pizza, or a yogurt. Now, look at Alice in her 14th century cottage. Her stomach growls too. But for her, there is no light. There is no cold. There is only the midnight larder, a dark, damp corner of the room where the smells of sour ale, salted pork, and drying herbs collide in a thick, invisible cloud. To eat at night in the Middle Ages isn't a casual snack. It is a tactical mission carried out in total darkness, where the prize might be a piece of bread as hard as a brick, and the enemy is waiting for you in the shadows. If you looked into the hearth of a medieval home in the evening, you'd see a blackened iron pot hanging over the dying embers. This was the pottage. It was the eternal flame of the stomach. It almost never went empty. In the evening, Alice would add whatever she had scavenged or harvested during the day. A handful of gray peas, some wilted leeks, maybe a few scraps of salt bacon if it was a feast day. By the time the family gathered for the final evening meal, this pottage had been simmering for hours or even days. It was a thick, brown, grain-heavy mush that provided the fuel for 16 hours of labor. But here is the secret of the medieval evening: the leftovers. That pottage would sit in that pot all night long in the cooling room. There was no putting it in a Tupperware. The acidity of the fermented grains and the constant low heat was the only thing keeping the bacteria at bay. If you woke up hungry in the night, you'd dip a wooden spoon into that cold, congealed mass. It was thick enough to stand a knife in, and it tasted of wood smoke and survival. But the true king of the midnight pantry was the bread. For a medieval woman, bread was life, but it was also a weapon. We are talking about maslin, or black bread, a dense, heavy loaf made from rye and barley. Because firewood was expensive and the village oven was often a communal monopoly, Alice didn't bake every day. She baked once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. By the time Friday evening rolled around, that loaf of bread sat on the shelf like a stone. It was so hard that cutting a slice required a heavy iron knife and significant upper body strength. This is why medieval soup, the pottage, was so essential. You didn't just eat the bread, you sopped it. You submerged the rock-hard crusts in the liquid to soften them enough to chew without breaking a tooth. In the dark of the evening, Alice would spend her final waking hour dressing the bread for tomorrow's breakfast, wrapping the loaves in damp cloths to try and coax a bit of softness back into the grain. As the house goes silent, a new sound begins. Scratch, scuttle, squeak. In the 14th century, you didn't live alone. You lived with a standing army of rodents. For the medieval woman, the evening wasn't just about feeding her family. It was about defending their food from the shadow thieves. Mice and rats were everywhere, in the thatch, under the floorboards, behind the grain chests. Imagine the frustration. You have worked 12 hours to harvest grain, another 3 hours to grind it by hand, and another 2 to bake it. If you leave it on the table, by morning, half of it will be gone, contaminated by droppings and filth. So, the medieval evening included a high-stakes storage ritual. Alice had to hang her food. Bacon slabs were suspended from the rafters. bread was kept in heavy wooden cratch boxes with slats to allow air but block teeth. In the pitch black, she would hear them. She'd hear the scratching of a rat trying to get into the grain bin. She might keep a mouser, a half-wild cat, in the kitchen. Or she might have to get up, grab a wooden clog, and swing blindly into the dark to protect her children's breakfast. This wasn't a chore. It was a war. Every calorie lost to a rat was a calorie her child wouldn't have during the winter. If you could see in the dark of that pantry, you'd see jars that seemed to be alive. They were bubbling, hissing, and breathing. This was the science of the sour. Without refrigeration, the medieval woman was a master of fermentation. In the evening, she'd check her ale wort. Ale was the primary hydration for everyone, children included, because the water was often a gamble with cholera. This ale was brewed in the evening, the yeast working in large wooden tubs. She'd listen to the fizz, smelling the sharp, yeasty tang. She'd check her sauerkraut, her pickled onions, her salted herrings. The air in the midnight pantry was an olfactory assault. It was the smell of salt, brine, vinegar, and aging meat. For us, it would be nauseating. For her, it was the smell of security. A strong smell meant the preservation was working. A sweet smell? That was the scent of rot. That was the scent of failure. Think about how you judge food today. You look at a printed best before date on a plastic wrapper. If it's 1 day past, you might throw it out. The medieval woman had no dates. She had the 3 senses. In the dark of the evening, she would pick up a piece of meat and smell it. She would touch the surface of the ale to feel the bloom of the yeast. She would taste a tiny drop of the brine to ensure the salt hadn't lost its strength. Her expiration date was her intuition, a biological database built over years of avoiding the gut ache. She was a chemist working in a laboratory of shadows. Every jar she sealed, every slab of meat she salted in the evening was a bet against the coming winter. As she finally finishes securing the larder, Alice might take one last sip of small ale, the weak third pressing of the grain. It's warm, flat, and slightly sour. She drinks it in the dark, listening to the house. The pottage is quiet. The rats are still scratching, but the grain is safe. The bread is wrapped. She has won the battle of the calories for one more night. But as she wipes the ale from her lips, she knows that the most grueling part of her evening is just beginning. Her hands are empty now, but they cannot stay that way. Because in the Middle Ages, an idle hand in the evening was a hand that invited poverty. It's time for the song of the spinning wheel. Listen. Beyond the crackle of the embers, beyond the scurrying of the rats, there is a sound that defines the medieval night. It is a rhythmic whir-click, whir-click. It is a hum that vibrates through the floorboards and into the bones of every woman in the village. This is the song of the spinning wheel, though in 1350, it was more likely the silent, gravity-bound dance of the drop spindle. In our modern world, we suffer from the scroll. We sit in the dark, our thumbs flicking endlessly across glass screens, consuming data we will forget in an hour. In the Middle Ages, the woman had the spin. Her hands were never empty. To sit idle in the evening wasn't just lazy, it was a sin against the family's survival. If the fire was the heart of the home, the fiber was its skin. And every inch of that skin had to be earned, one twist of the wrist at a time. Imagine a woman named Alice. She is sitting on a low stool. Tucked under her left arm is the distaff, a wooden stick wrapped in a cloud of raw, unspun wool or flax. To a modern observer, She looks like she's carrying a strange, fuzzy torch. But to Alice, that distaff is an extension of her body. In her right hand, she holds the spindle, a weighted stick that hangs toward the floor. With a sharp flick of her fingers, she sends the spindle spinning. As it drops, gravity pulls the fibers from the distaff, and her fingers tease the wool, guiding it, thinning it, twisting it into a single, continuous thread. This is a high-stakes game of tension. Too much pull, and the thread snaps, sending the spindle clattering across the dirt floor. Too little, and the yarn becomes a lumpy, useless mess. Now remember, she is doing this in the yellow fog of a tallow rushlight. Or worse, she is doing it in the pitch black by the dying light of the hearth. This is the part that would baffle a modern craftswoman. The medieval woman didn't spin with her eyes. She spun with her night vision fingers. Over years of labor, the tips of her fingers have become a sophisticated sensory laboratory. She can feel the difference of a single micron in the thickness of the wool. She can sense a slub or a knot before it even leaves the distaff. In the evening, as the light fails, her eyes rest, but her hands accelerate. She is blind spinning. The rhythmic motion becomes meditative, almost a trance state. This is how she reclaims her time. While her mouth might be reciting a prayer or whispering a story to a sleepy child, her hands are producing the wealth of the household. The air around her as she spins is thick. Raw wool is not the clean, fluffy stuff you buy in a craft store. It is in the grease. It is saturated with lanolin, the natural oil from the sheep's skin, mixed with bits of dried grass, dirt, and, well, sheep manure. As she teases the fiber, the warmth of her hands melts the lanolin. It coats her skin, a thick, waxy lubricant that makes her hands waterproof, but also traps the grime of the day. The smell is heavy and animalistic. It is the scent of the field brought into the cottage. For Alice, this lanolin is her only skincare. It heals the cracks in her skin caused by the winter cold, but it also means she is never truly clean. She carries the scent of the flock into her bed every single night. Spinning is lonely, repetitive, and mind-numbingly boring. To combat the silence of the night, medieval women turned to the only technology they had for mental stimulation: the distaff songs. When the village was quiet, you could hear them. A woman in one cottage would begin a low, rhythmic chant. A neighbor, hearing it through the thin walls or the thatch, would pick up the harmony. These weren't just pretty tunes. They were work songs, timed to the beat of the spindle's rotation. They were stories of legendary queens, of saints who escaped fire, of unfaithful knights and vengeful forest spirits. These songs were the audiobooks of 1350. They were how history was passed down. While men wrote the chronicles in Latin in cold monasteries, women sang the real history, the history of the heart, the womb, and the hearth, in the evening dark. Every thread she spun was vibrating with the lyrics of 1,000 years of female endurance. But let's look closer at Alice. Look at her silhouette in the flickering light. Her body is a map of her labor. Because she always holds the distaff under her left arm, her left shoulder is permanently hitched higher than her right. Her spine has a subtle, persistent curve. The spinter's lean. Her fingers are the most telltale sign. The skin on her thumb and forefinger is as tough as leather, scarred by the constant friction of the fiber. Her joints are swollen with early onset arthritis, aggravated by the damp evening air. By the age of 30, Alice has likely spun enough thread to reach from London to Rome, and she has done it all while sitting on a backless stool, her neck craned forward to catch the last scrap of light. This is the gym of the Middle Ages. There are no rest days. There are no ergonomic chairs. There is only the fiber and the relentless demand for more. Why the rush? Why spend every waking second spinning? Because in the 14th century, thread was currency. It took 10 spinners to keep one weaver busy. To clothe a family of 4 in basic tunics and hose required miles of yarn. But it was more than that. Spinning was a woman's social security. If she was a widow, or if her husband's harvest failed, her evening yarn was the only thing she could trade for grain or ale. A spinster, a term that we now use as an insult, was originally a woman of high economic value. She was a producer. She was someone who could literally spin money out of thin air and raw wool. When you see a medieval woman in a painting, she is often holding a distaff. It wasn't just a prop. It was her badge of office. It was her power. Why the rush? Why spend every waking second spinning? Because in the 14th century, thread was currency. It took 10 spinners to keep one weaver busy. To clothe a family of 4 in basic tunics and hose required miles of yarn. But it was more than that. Spinning was a woman's social security. If she was a widow, or if her husband's harvest failed, her evening yarn was the only thing she could trade for grain or ale. A spinster, a term that we now use as an insult, was originally a woman of high economic value. She was a producer. She was someone who could literally spin money out of thin air and raw wool. When you see a medieval woman in a painting, she is often holding a distaff. It wasn't just a prop. It was her badge of office. It was her power. There is a secret power in the spinning circle. When women gathered in the evening, the veillée in France, to spin together, they created a space that men could not enter. In the hum of the wheels and the click of the spindles, they plotted. They shared news of the manor lord's cruelty. They traded secrets of herbal contraception. They organized mutual aid for the sick. The song of the spinning wheel was the background noise of a silent female revolution. It was the only time they were truly in control of their own voices and their own labor. But as the night deepens, the labor in the cottage is a world away from the labor in the castle. Because while Alice is spinning coarse wool to avoid freezing, another woman, miles away in a stone tower, is pulling a very different kind of thread, a thread of gold, of silk, and of power. But before we climb those castle stairs to see how the other half lived their nights, we must ask, what happens when the spinning stops? What happens when the tallow runs out and the cottage goes cold? Because in 1350, the most dangerous part of the night isn't the work. It's the demons waiting in the corners. Leave the soot-stained cottage behind. Let the smell of burning sheep fat fade from your memory. We are climbing the spiral stone stairs of a fortress, moving from the world of survival to the world of strategy. If the peasant's evening was a battle against hunger, the noblewoman's evening was a battle for influence. In the year 1350, as the sun sets over the battlements, a lady, let's call her Eleanor, doesn't reach for a rushlight. She stands as her attendants light tall, slender tapers of pure beeswax. The air doesn't turn yellow and greasy. It glows with a soft, golden warmth that smells of summer meadows and honey. But don't let the beauty fool you. The Great Hall is a stage, and every movement Eleanor makes in the evening is a line in a high-stakes political drama. The Great Hall in the evening was the beating heart of the feudal system. It was a massive, echoing space of stone and timber, draped in heavy tapestries that moved like ghosts in the draft. These tapestries weren't just for decoration. They were the primary insulation, a desperate attempt to keep the damp cold of the castle walls from leaching the heat out of your bones. In the evening, Eleanor is never alone. This is the first thing a modern woman would find suffocating: the total absence of privacy. A noblewoman lived her life in public. She was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, pages, squires, and guards. Every whisper, every glance at her husband, every choice of wine was observed and recorded in the social ledger of the court. Her evening was a performance of graciousness, a calculated display of her family's wealth and stability. If she looked tired, it signaled weakness. If she looked neglected, it signaled a failing marriage, which, in 1350, meant a failing political alliance. While the peasants played bullet pudding or told ghost stories, the nobility engaged in a much more dangerous game: chess. But in the Middle Ages, chess wasn't just a pastime. It was a simulator for the battlefield and the court. It was one of the few arenas where a woman like Eleanor was expected to be a man's intellectual equal, and often his superior. Imagine the scene. Eleanor sits across from a visiting baron. The board is made of ebony and ivory. The pieces are heavy, carved with intricate, terrifying detail. As the tallow light flickers, she makes a move with her queen. In the 14th century, the queen was the most powerful piece on the board, just as Eleanor was often the most powerful diplomat in the castle, while her husband was away at war. Every move on the board was a metaphor. A win wasn't just about the game. It was about asserting her dominance, her wit, and her fitness to rule. A woman who could trap a baron's king in the evening was a woman who could navigate a treaty or a siege in the morning. Chess was the house of cards of the 14th century, played in hushed tones while the fire roared in the massive hearth. If Alice in her cottage was spinning rough wool for survival, Eleanor in the great hall was stitching silk for legacy. Embroidery was the fine art of the medieval noblewoman. But again, it wasn't a hobby. It was opus Anglicanum, English work, highly prized across Europe. Eleanor spends her evening hours hunched over a frame of fine linen. Her thread isn't wool, it's silk dyed in vibrant crimsons and deep blues, often wrapped in actual gold or silver wire. This was the fancy work. She was creating vestments for the church, banners for her husband's knights, or gowns for her daughter's weddings. Every stitch was a display of wealth. To spend 500 hours on a single sleeve was to say to the world, "My family has so much power that I can afford to waste my time on beauty." But more than that, the embroidery circle was the information hub. While their needles flew, Eleanor and her ladies-in-waiting traded the real currency of the castle: secrets. They knew who was in debt, who was planning a rebellion, and whose daughter was being promised to which rival. The embroidery frame was the 14th century situation room. The sound of Eleanor's evening wasn't the hum of a spinning wheel. It was the pluck of a lute and the voice of a troubadour. Minstrels were the media giants of the age. They traveled from castle to castle, bringing news, poetry, and songs. But a noblewoman had to be a careful listener. The songs of courtly love, of knights pining for unattainable ladies, were often coded political messages. A song about a lion and a stag might be a commentary on the king's latest tax decree. Eleanor used these evening performances to gauge the political climate. Was the troubadour singing songs that favored the French? Was there a subtle mockery in his tone when he mentioned her husband's liege lord? The music was the news feed, and Eleanor had to filter the truth from the propaganda. She was a media analyst in a gown of velvet. We often romanticize the life of a medieval queen or duchess, but Eleanor's physical reality in the evening was a different kind of torture than Alice's. Her gown was made of yards of heavy velvet and brocade, weighing nearly as much as a suit of armor. Her waist was restricted by stays that made every breath a conscious effort. Her head was burdened by an elaborate headdress, perhaps a wimple, or a crisp linen veil that required her to keep her neck perfectly straight for hours. She couldn't slouch. She couldn't scratch. She couldn't relax. She was a living monument to her rank. While the peasant woman's body was worn out by labor, the noble woman's body was shaped by the rigid demands of etiquette. By 10 p.m., Eleanor's back was a wall of pain, and her head throbbed from the weight of her crown or circlet. But she smiled, because in the great hall, a frown could start a war. Think about a corporate power dinner today. You're in a high-end restaurant, wearing a tailored suit, navigating a multi-course meal while discussing a merger. You feel the pressure of the deal. Now, look at Eleanor. She is doing the same thing, but the stakes are her family's life, her lands, and her soul. There is no human resources to complain to. There is no off-the-clock time. Her evening is a 24/7 audit of her value to the feudal machine. She isn't just having dinner, she is maintaining an empire. As the evening deepens, the great hall feels smaller. Even with dozens of beeswax candles, the corners remain pitch black. The tapestries shiver in the draft, and the fire in the hearth begins to fade to orange. Eleanor signals to her pages. The performance is coming to an end. She has successfully navigated the chess game, managed the ladies-in-waiting, and decoded the minstrel's propaganda. She has maintained the mask of nobility. But as she prepares to retire to her private solar, she knows that the soft gold of the beeswax is only a thin veneer. Beyond the castle walls, the real Middle Ages are waiting. The world of Alice, the world of the plague, and the world of the old ways that no amount of silk can hide. Eleanor has her gold threads, but there is another kind of woman in the village, one who doesn't use thread to decorate, but to heal, or to harm. While Eleanor plays chess in the castle, a woman in a small hut at the edge of the forest is preparing a different kind of evening. She has no silk, and she has no courtly songs. She has only the night-blooming plants and the secrets of the earth. She is the woman the church fears, and the villagers depend on. She is the herb wife, and her evening is just beginning. What is she brewing in the dark? And why does even a lady like Eleanor sometimes send a secret messenger to her door under the cover of night? Leave the honeyed scent of Eleanor's great hall. Descend the castle hill, cross the moonlit meadows, and follow the smell of damp earth and bitter vinegar to the edge of the dark woods. Here, in a hut made of wattle and daub, lives a woman the church calls Old Mother, the villagers call the Cunning Woman, and the night calls its own. In the year 1350, if your child is burning with a fever that no prayer can quench, or if you are a young girl with a secret growing in your womb that would get you stoned in the village square, you do not go to the priest. You wait for the cover of the great silence. You wait for the herb wife. Her evening isn't spent spinning or playing chess. It is spent in the laboratory of the shadows, where she distills the very essence of the earth into life, death, and beauty. Step inside. The air is so thick with the scent of drying mugwort, valerian, and wild garlic that it coats your tongue. From the rafters hang bundles of blackened roots and skeletal leaves, swaying like the victims of a gallows. While the rest of the world sleeps, the herb wife is at her most alert. The night is her harvest time. To a medieval shadow doctor, the moon is as important as the sun. She believes that plants gathered under a waning moon have the power to pull poisons from the blood, while those picked under a full moon can bolster the spirit. She spends her evening hours sorting through night-blooming flowers, their petals pale and ghostly in the dim light of a single oil lamp. She is a master of a science that has no books, a vast oral encyclopedia of the forest floor, passed from grandmother to granddaughter since the dawn of time. Let's talk about the most terrifying secret in her cabinet. Atrapa belladonna, the deadly nightshade. In the great hall, Lady Eleanor wants to look radiant for the Baron, but the evening is long, and the smoke from the torches makes the eyes dull and red-rimmed. The herbwife knows a secret. She takes the dark, glossy berries of the nightshade and distills them into a potent decoction. She calls it belladonna, the beautiful lady. A tiny drop in each eye, and the pupils dilate until they are huge, dark pools of liquid mystery. It makes a woman's eyes sparkle with an ethereal, haunting beauty that can drive a man to madness. But there is a shadow price. The herbwife watches as the young girls who buy this tincture begin to suffer. First, their vision blurs. Then come the hallucinations, the feeling of spiders crawling on the skin, the sight of demons in the curtains. Use too much, too often, and the beautiful lady leaves you in a world of permanent darkness. Blindness. This is the dark side of medieval beauty, a desperate gamble where you trade your sight for a few hours of radiance in the candle light. If you cannot sleep in 1350, you don't take a pill, you take a soporific. The herbwife spends her evening grinding the roots of the mandrake. To the medieval mind, this root was semi-sentient, a humanoid shape that screamed when pulled from the earth, a scream so loud it could kill a man. The herbwife treats the mandrake with a terrifying respect. In the quiet of her hut, she boils the root with opium poppies and henbane. The resulting sleeping sponge, or tincture, is the only thing that can soothe a man whose leg has been crushed by a cart, or a woman whose heart is breaking with grief. But she must be precise. A few drops too many, and the sleep becomes eternal. She is a woman who walks the razor's edge between healer and executioner every single evening. But the most dangerous secret she keeps is the one whispered behind the hand. In the Middle Ages, a woman's body was public property, owned by her father, her husband, or the church. But the herbwife knows the old ways of control. In the deep evening, women from all walks of life, the scullery maid, the miller's wife, and even the veiled lady from the castle, slip into her hut. They come for the tansy or the pennyroyal. These are the herbs of the womb. The herbwife knows which decoctions can bring on a delayed flow or prevent a child from taking root in a body too weak to bear it. This was the invisible war of the Middle Ages. The church condemned these potions of sterility as the work of the devil. To possess them was to invite the stake. Yet, every evening, the herbwife continues her work. She is the guardian of female autonomy in a world that allowed none. She is the one who ensures that a woman's life isn't just a series of fatal births. She is a revolutionary in a kirtle of rough wool. Look at her hands. They are stained purple with juice, scarred by thorns, and smelled of earth. She is the most essential person in the village, yet she is also the most feared. In the evening, when the village elders sit by their fires, they talk of her. They say she talks to the owls. They say she can turn a man into a hare. They call her a hag, a word derived from the Old English hegtes, meaning hedge rider, someone who straddles the boundary between the civilized village and the wild forest. The herb wife hears the whispers. She knows that the same priest who condemns her from the pulpit will send his housekeeper to her back door for a tincture of heartsease by midnight. She lives in a state of necessary exile. Her evening is a solitary one, spent in the company of her bubbling pots and drying bundles. She has no social circle, only a list of secrets she must carry to her grave. Think about our modern obsession with natural healing. You follow a wellness influencer on social media who tells you to drink celery juice and use essential oils. It's aesthetic. It's clean. It's branded in soft pastel colors. Now look at the herb wife. Her natural healing is gritty, dangerous, and smells like rot. She doesn't have an aesthetic. She has a survival rate. She isn't trying to sell you a vibe. She is trying to keep your baby from dying of a cough before sunrise. Her essential oils are potent neurotoxins that could kill you if she miscounts the drops. We have sanitized nature. She lived inside its belly. We play with herbs. She negotiated with them. As the night reaches its deepest point, the herb wife performs one last ritual. She burns a bunch of dried rowan and sage. She carries the smoking bundle to the four corners of her hut, a ritual of smudging to keep the evil eye away. She knows that the line between medicine and witchcraft is purely political. In the eyes of the church, if she heals you with a prayer, it's a miracle. If she heals you with a root, it's a crime. She is a scientist in an age of superstition, a doctor who has to hide her clinic in the dark. As she finally sits down, her back aching, her eyes heavy from the fumes of the mandrake, she watches the shadows dance on the wall. She hears the owls calling from the woods. She knows that tomorrow, the village will call her a witch again. But tonight, she is the only thing standing between them and the grave. But even the herb wife, with all her roots and smudging smoke, feels a chill when the wind changes. Because in 1350, the danger isn't just physical. It isn't just sickness or hunger. There is something else in the dark. Something that roots cannot cure and prayers cannot always stop. As the herb wife looks at her window, she sees not just the reflection of her lamp, but a movement in the trees. The villagers aren't just afraid of her. They are afraid of the others, the ones who roam the night hags, the incubi, and the spirits of the unholy. What happens when the herb wife's secrets aren't enough? What do medieval people do when the darkness starts to stare back? It's time to talk about the demons in the corners. Have you ever felt a prickle on the back of your neck when you're alone in the dark? That sudden, irrational certainty that something is standing just behind you, its breath cold against your skin? In the 21st century, you tell yourself it's just your imagination. You turn on the light, and the fear dissolves. But for a woman in 1350, that feeling wasn't imagination. It was an observation. As the embers of her hearth turn to gray ash, Alice doesn't just see shadows. She sees a battlefield. To her, the darkness is a liquid medium in which demons, night hags, and the restless dead swim like sharks. The corners of her room aren't empty space. They are portals. This is the hour of the old hag, the hour of the Mara, and if she doesn't protect her family now, they might not wake up with their souls intact. The most terrifying monster of the medieval night wasn't a wolf or a thief. It was the night hag, the Mara. We know it today as sleep paralysis, a biological glitch where the brain wakes up before the body. But to Alice, it is a physical assault. Imagine waking up in the pitch black. You cannot move. You cannot scream. And there, sitting on your chest, is a hunched, invisible weight, pressing the breath from your lungs. You feel its fingers around your throat. This is the nightmare. The medieval woman believes this entity has ridden her through the night like a horse, draining her life force. In her evening rituals, Alice must prepare for this. She doesn't have a sleep routine. She has a spiritual fortification. She places her shoes at the foot of the bed with the toes pointing outward, a trick to confuse the hag, making her believe the occupant has already left. It's a desperate, superstitious dance, a woman trying to outsmart a demon with a pair of leather clogs. If you looked under the straw pallet where Alice sleeps, you'd find something strange. An iron knife, or perhaps a set of iron shears. In the Middle Ages, cold iron was the ultimate deterrent. It was believed that supernatural creatures, demons, fairies, and spirits could not stand the touch of iron. It represented the triumph of human civilization over the chaotic wild. Every evening, as the light fails, Alice performs a ritual of binding. She touches the iron blade to the doorframe, the windowsill, and finally, she tucks it under her pillow. It is her silent bodyguard. And then, there is the salt. Salt was purity. Salt was incorruptible. In the deep evening, she might sprinkle a circle of salt around the cradle of her infant. She is drawing a line in the dirt, a border that no evil eye can cross. To us, it looks like a mess on the floor. To her, it is a high-tech security system, a barrier between her child and the hungry spirits of the unbaptized dead. Medieval people didn't have minutes, but they had watches, and they knew the dead of night, the time between midnight and the first cock crow. This was when the veil was thinnest. As Alice lies awake, listening to the house, she is hyper-aware of the thinning. Every creak of the roof is a demon trying to pry its way in. Every rustle in the straw is a boggart looking for a toe to grab. She recites the night spell, a rhythmic, rhyming prayer to the saints, asking them to stand guard at the four corners of her bed. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bless the bed that I lie on. This wasn't just a nursery rhyme. It was an incantation. It was a verbal shield she built around herself and her family every single night. The psychological pressure is immense. Imagine the exhaustion of being a guard for your own soul, night after night, for your entire life. The medieval home had a demonic geography. The threshold of the door was a weak point. The chimney was an open road for the night flyers. The dark space under the bed was a cavern for the lurkers. In the evening, Alice manages these points. She hangs a hagstone, a stone with a natural hole through it, above the door to filter out bad dreams. She makes the sign of the cross in the soot of the chimney. She never leaves a mirror uncovered at night, fearing that a demon might use her own reflection to pull her into the other world. She is a spatial manager of the supernatural. She is constantly auditing her environment for spiritual leaks. Think about your home security today. You have a Ring camera on your porch. You have motion sensor lights. You have an alarm system that chirps when a door opens. You feel safe because you can see the threat on your phone. Now look at Alice. Her threat is invisible. Her camera is her intuition. Her alarm is the sound of a nail falling or a dog growling in its sleep. She doesn't fear a burglar. She fears a curse. We have externalized our fear into technology. She internalized it into ritual. We worry about our data privacy. She worried about her soul privacy. Why were they so afraid? Why did they see demons in every corner? Think about the conditions. They were living in a state of chronic sensory deprivation. Total darkness, combined with the low-level carbon monoxide poisoning from the hearth smoke, and the ergot fungus often found in their rye bread, which caused vivid hallucinations, created a hallucination factory. The medieval night was a fever dream. When Alice sees a shadow move in the corner, she isn't crazy. Her brain, starving for light and oxygen, is literally constructing a demon out of the gloom. Her superstition was a logical way to explain a terrifying biological experience. She wasn't fighting ghosts, she was fighting her own brain's reaction to the dark. As the night reaches its deepest point, the sounds of the cottage change. The wood settles, the temperature drops. To Alice, these are the voices of the house. She believes the spirits of her ancestors are still here, watching from the rafters. She might leave a small offering, a crust of bread or a drop of ale, on the hearth before she sleeps. This isn't for a demon. It's for the brownie or the hob, the household spirit that protects the home if treated well, but ruins it if insulted. The evening is a time of spiritual diplomacy. She is negotiating with the unseen residents of her home, ensuring that the balance is maintained. She is the peacemaker between the living and the dead. But what happens when the salt is crossed? What happens when the iron fails and the old hag is already at the door? There is one last line of defense, a power greater than herbs, greater than iron, and greater than salt. It is the power of the church, the power of the night vigil, and the absolute, terrifying beauty of the sacred night. As Alice clutches her iron knife, she hears the distant bell of the monastery. The monks are rising. The great shield is being activated. But for a woman, the church's protection came with a heavy price. It's time to move from the demons in the corners to the sanctuary of the soul. What were the night vigils really about? And why was a woman's prayer in the dark considered both a weapon and a sin? The iron knife under the pillow, the salt on the floor. These were the weapons of the earth. But Alice knows that against the Prince of Darkness, steel and brine are not enough. As the clock of the world slows to a crawl, she reaches for her ultimate shield, the sacred night. In the year 1350, religion wasn't a choice. It was the atmosphere. You didn't believe in God any more than you believed in the rain. He was a fact, a judge, and a protector. For the medieval woman, the evening prayer wasn't just a polite thank you before sleep. It was a tactical maneuver. It was a night vigil, a conscious effort to keep the soul awake while the body rested. Because in the Middle Ages, the greatest danger of the night wasn't being murdered in your bed. It was dying in your sleep without your last confession. Before the polished, colorful rosaries we see today, there were paternoster beads. If you were Alice, you might not own a set of ivory or amber. Your rosary was a simple length of hemp rope knotted at intervals. In the deep evening, your hands, still smelling of the spinning wheel and the sheep, would find these knots in the dark. One knot, one Our Father, another knot, a Hail Mary. This wasn't just mindless repetition. It was a spiritual counting house. You were literally tallying your safety. Every prayer was a brick in a wall you were building between your family and hell. Imagine the tactile reality of this. In the pitch black, your fingers move rhythmically along the rough cord. You are weaving protection. You might spend an hour, 2 hours, just moving your thumbs across those knots. It was a form of manual devotion, a way for a woman whose life was defined by labor to offer that labor to the divine. Her prayer was a work song for the soul. Even if Alice never stepped foot inside a convent, Her night was shaped by the monastic rhythm. The church divided the day and night into hours, matins, lauds, prime, and so on. Around midnight, while the village is a graveyard of silence, the bells of the distant monastery begin to toll for matins. The monks are rising to sing. For the woman in the cottage, these bells are an alarm clock for the spirit. She might not get out of her bed. The floor is too cold, her body too tired. But she wakes. She lies in the dark, her heart racing, joining her silent prayers to the distant chanting. She is part of an invisible monastery. She believes that as long as someone, somewhere, is praying, the world will not fall into the abyss. She sees herself as a prayer warrior on the night shift. While her husband dreams of the harvest, she is guarding the spiritual threshold of the house. For some women, this evening devotion went to extremes. There were anchoresses, women who chose to be literally walled into small stone cells attached to a church, living their entire lives in a permanent night vigil. But every medieval mother was a bit of an anachoress. Her cottage was her cell. Her hearth was her altar. In the evening, she would perform a hearth blessing. She'd make the sign of the cross in the soot of the chimney, believing that the smoke carried her prayers directly to the ears of the saints. She'd pray to Saint Margaret for her next labor, to Saint Nicholas for her children's safety, and to the Virgin Mary for everything else. Mary was her divine sister. The medieval woman felt an intimacy with the Mother of God that we have lost. In the dark, she would talk to Mary as if she were sitting right there on the stool beside her. She'd share her fears about the plague, her frustrations with the price of grain, her grief over the baby she lost last winter. The evening prayer was the only therapy she had, a safe space to pour out the unspoken heavy of her life to a woman who had also suffered. But let's be honest, this wasn't all comfort. It was driven by a deep, existential terror. The medieval church taught the reality of purgatory, a place of cleansing fire where you'd pay for every unforgiven moment of your life. Every evening, Alice would perform a mental audit. Did I lose my temper with the children today? Did I covet my neighbor's new tunic? Did I forget to give a crust of bread to the beggar at the gate? These weren't small mistakes, they were debts. She would pray indulgences, specific prayers that were believed to knock years off your time in purgatory. She was paying her spiritual taxes. In the dark, she'd count her aves and paters like a nervous accountant, trying to ensure that if she died before dawn, her soul wouldn't be bankrupt. This constant state of moral vigilance is a weight we can barely imagine. To never truly rest, even in prayer, because you are always under the eye of the divine auditor. Think about our modern evening routine. You might use a mindfulness app. A soothing voice tells you to release your thoughts and find your inner peace. It's about you. It's about your mental health. Now look at Alice. Her evening routine isn't about peace. It's about propitiation. She isn't trying to find herself. She's trying to hide from the wrath. She isn't meditating. She is interceding. We have replaced the divine judge with self-care. We seek Zen. She sought mercy. Our silence is for relaxation. Her silence was for reverence. There was a strange paradox in this spiritual life. While the church denied women any formal power, no preaching, no administering sacraments, it conceded that women were naturally more spiritual. In the evening prayer circle, a woman's voice carried weight. If a mother was particularly devout, her family believed her prayers were stronger. She could protect her sons at war through her nightly vigils. She could ensure her husband's success at the fair through her intercessions. The night vigil was a form of soft power. It was a way for a woman to influence the world without ever leaving her cottage. She was a diplomat at the court of heaven, negotiating for the lives of those she loved. As the night reaches its deepest point, the prayer becomes silent. Alice is too tired for words. She just breathes. She believes that even her breathing, if done with intention, is a prayer. She listens to the breaths of her sleeping family. To her, these are the prayers of the innocent. She gathers these breaths in her mind and offers them up. This is the mother's vigil, the absolute quiet dedication of a woman who knows that her family's safety is a miracle that must be requested every single night. Finally, the first hint of gray appears in the sky. The bells toll for lauds, the morning prayer. The monks are singing of the rising sun, of the victory of light over darkness. Alice opens her eyes. She is exhausted. Her knees ache from the cold floor. Her hands are cramped from the knotted rope. But she feels a sense of profound cleansing. She has survived the night hags and the demons of the corners. She has paid her spiritual taxes. She has held the line. She has been the master of the hearth and the guardian of the soul. But as she rises to start the fire, she realizes that there is one thing her prayers and her labor haven't unlocked: a world beyond the village, a world of words, of ink, and of the dangerous other knowledge. Because while Alice is praying in the dark, another kind of woman is doing something even more radical. She isn't counting knots on a rope. She is tracing letters on a page. In an age where 95% of women are illiterate, how did the shadow scholars learn to read in the dark? Why was a woman with a book considered even more dangerous than a woman with a root? And what happens when a medieval woman decides that the great silence isn't enough, and she wants to leave a mark that outlasts the tallow smoke? It's time to talk about the education in silence. In the year 1350, knowledge is a fortress. Its walls are built of stone, its gates are guarded by the church, and its language is Latin, a tongue that 99% of the population cannot speak. For a woman, the library is a locked room, and the book is a holy relic she is barely allowed to touch, let alone understand. But as the great silence falls over the village, and the village elders dream of harvests and taxes, a different kind of fire is being lit. Not in the hearth, but in the mind. Imagine Alice again. She has finished her spinning. Her family is asleep. The cottage is black. But she doesn't lie down. She reaches into the cooling hearth and pulls out a charred stick, a shadow pen. On the dirt floor of her kitchen, by the dying orange glow of a single coal, she begins to draw. Not a flower, not a cross. She draws a shape, the letter A. This is the most dangerous act she will perform all year. This is the education in silence. In the Middle Ages, literacy for a woman was often viewed as a spiritual and social infection. A woman who could read was a woman who could encounter ideas without a man to filter them. She could read the Gospels and find her own meaning. She could read poetry and discover her own desire. She could read the law and see her own chains. But curiosity is a hunger that even the church couldn't starve. While formal schools were for boys destined for the priesthood, shadow schools existed in the corners of the night. A grandmother who had once been a servant in a noble house might pass down the alphabet secret to her granddaughter. A wandering minstrel might trade a few letters for a bowl of pottage. For Alice, the evening is her classroom. Her slate is the soot-covered back stone of the chimney or the soft earth under her stool. She practices her letters in the dark, her fingers tracing the curves over and over until they are burned into her muscle memory. She has no paper, it's too expensive. She has no ink. She has only the black script of the fire. She is an ash scholar, learning the world one letter at a time. Now, move back to Eleanor's castle. She has access to books, but even for a lady, reading in the evening is a tactical challenge. Books in 1350 are manuscripts, literally handwritten. They are made of vellum, dried calfskin, and a single volume can cost as much as a small farm. Eleanor owns a book of hours, a personal devotional filled with beautiful, intricate illustrations and prayers. In the deep evening, when her attendants have finally left her, she does something forbidden. She pulls her chair to the narrow stone window. The moon is full, casting a cold, silver light across the page. Have you ever tried to read by moonlight? The letters dance. The colors of the illuminations, the lapis lazuli blues and the real gold leaf, become ghostly and strange. She traces the Latin words she has painstakingly memorized. She isn't just praying, she is decoding. She is claiming the power of the word. For Eleanor, this secret reading is a sanctuary. In the pages of her book, she escapes the political chess of the Great Hall. She finds a space where she is not a wife, a mother, or a pawn, but a mind in conversation with the ages. If reading was a spiritual infection, writing was an act of high treason. To write is to leave a mark. To write is to say, I existed. This is what I thought. In the 14th century, a woman with a quill was a threat to the natural order, but some women refused to stay silent. Think of Julian of Norwich or Catherine of Siena, women who took the night hours to record their visions, their theological arguments, and their letters to popes and kings. In the silence of the night, these women were scriptorium rebels. They used the hours when the male world was asleep to build an intellectual legacy that would outlast the stone cathedrals. They wrote in the vernacular, the language of the people, making knowledge accessible to other women. Their pens were their swords, and they wielded them in the dark, where no one could stop the flow of ink. Stop for a second. Think about your reading today. You consume thousands of words every hour. Tweets, headlines, captions, emails. Information is a flood, and most of it is meaningless. You skim the world. Now look at Alice. She has one letter, one shape. Or look at Eleanor. She has one book. She doesn't skim. She devours. She reads the same sentence 100 times until it becomes part of her soul. She doesn't have data. She has wisdom. We have gained the world's information, but we have lost the intensity of the single sentence. We have followers. They had deep thoughts. Why go to all this trouble? Why risk being called a witch or a heretic just to learn to read in the dark? Because knowledge changed the shape of the night. When you are illiterate, the darkness is filled with demons and superstitions. But when you can read, the night is filled with voices. The stars aren't just sparks of light. They are the heavenly spheres described in the manuscripts. The herbs aren't just roots. They are the simples mentioned in the ancient herbals. Education didn't just give these women facts. It gave them perspective. It allowed them to see the big picture beyond their village or their castle walls. It turned the great silence into a great conversation. A woman with a book in the dark was never truly alone. As the night deepens, the shadow scholar finishes her work. Alice brushes the dirt over her A on the floor, hiding the evidence of her rebellion. Eleanor closes her book of hours and hides it in a locked chest. The ink is dry. The ash is cold. They have stolen a piece of the sun. They have claimed a portion of the human legacy that was supposed to be denied to them. They are the reason we are here today, talking about their lives. They were the link in the chain that kept knowledge alive when the world tried to bury it in the dark. But the mind can only stay awake so long when the body is exhausted. The education in silence is over for tonight. The ash scholar and the castle lady both feel the weight of their eyelids. They have navigated the fire, the fat, the food, the fiber, and the faith. Now they must face the most basic, most neglected part of their existence, their own bodies. Before they can surrender to sleep, they must perform the intimate rituals, the secret acts of hygiene and grooming that the Middle Ages kept hidden in the shadows. What did a medieval woman actually do to stay clean in a world of mud and soot? What were the beauty secrets of the 14th century? And why was the bath considered both a luxury and a danger to the soul? It's time to talk about the bath and the grooming. Close your eyes and think of a medieval movie. You see a beautiful maiden stepping into a steaming wooden tub filled with rose petals, her skin glowing under the torchlight. It looks like a high-end spa day in the 14th century. Now, open your eyes. To be a woman in 1350 is to live in a world where the bath is not a relaxation. It is a medical gamble. In the deep evening, as Alis prepares for bed, she doesn't reach for a loofah or a lavender-scented body wash. She reaches for a piece of dry linen and a basin of cold, hard water. This is the grooming of the shadows, a ritual defined by a terrifying fear of your own pores. To understand medieval hygiene, you have to understand the science of the time, the humors. The church and the doctors believed that the body was a delicate balance of fluids, and the skin was a porous wall. They believed that hot water opened the pores, and in a world filled with the Black Death and miasmas, foul air that carried disease, an open pore was an open door for the plague. To take a full hot bath in the evening was considered an act of extreme bravery or extreme foolishness. It was like leaving your front door unlocked in a neighborhood full of thieves. You were inviting the evil air to enter your organs. So, for Alis, staying clean wasn't about submerging her body in water. It was about surface management. If you walked into Alice's bedroom in the evening, you'd see her performing the dry bath. She takes a coarse linen cloth and vigorously rubs her skin. This wasn't just a quick wipe, it was a physical exfoliation. Linen was the cleansing technology of the Middle Ages. It was believed that linen had a magnetic quality, that it could draw out the sweat, oil, and grime from the skin without needing to use dangerous water. She rubs her neck, her arms, and her torso until her skin is pink and glowing. She is literally scraping the day off her body. But think about the reality. She's been working in the fields, cooking over a smoky hearth, and spinning raw wool. She is covered in soot, grease, and animal dander. Scrubbing that off with a dry cloth in the dark of the evening is a grueling, abrasive process. Her skin is tough, weathered, and likely smells of the linen acid, that sharp, metallic scent of sweat trapped in fabric. Of course, some water was used. In the deep evening, Alice would use a small ceramic basin, a ewer, to perform what we might call a selective wash. She focuses on the essential areas: her hands, her face, and her feet. Her hands, because they touch the food and the holy beads. Her face, because it is the mirror of the soul. Her feet, because the mud of the village lanes is a breeding ground for infection. The water is cold, drawn from the well hours ago. There is no warm-up period. Every splash is a shock to the system. The soap? If she's lucky, it's a liquid soap made from wood ash and animal fat. It's caustic, it stings, and it strips the oils from her skin. If she's poor, she might just use a handful of sand or a bit of bran to act as a scrub. Cleaning yourself in 1350 was a mechanical act of friction, not a chemical act of suds. While her body is rubbed, her hair is harvested. In the Middle Ages, a woman's hair was her crowning glory, but it was also a magnet for lice, dust, and smoke. Because she cannot wash her hair with water, imagine trying to dry hip-length hair in a damp cottage with no heat. She uses the evening brush, using a comb made of wood, bone, or even lead, believed to darken the hair. She brushes her hair for 100, 200, 500 strokes. This serves two purposes. First, it physically removes the debris from the day. Second, it redistributes the natural oils, the sebum, down the length of the hair. This grease was actually a protective coating. It kept the hair strong and shiny, even if it smelled faintly of wood smoke. As she brushes, she might use a dry shampoo, a powder made of ground orris root, or dried herbs like lavender and rosemary. She is powdering out the grease. This is the origin of the powdered look that would dominate the elite for centuries to come. It was born of a desperate attempt to look clean without ever touching water. Let's address the elephant in the room: the smell. In the 14th century, everyone smelled. The priest, the peasant, the noblewoman. They lived in an olfactory soup of unwashed bodies, manure, and smoke. But they weren't oblivious to it. They were obsessed with sweet air. In the evening, Alice might use pomanders, or small sachets of dried herbs. She would rub a piece of dried lavender behind her ears, or tuck a clove under her armpit. This wasn't just to smell nice. To the medieval mind, a bad smell was the disease. By surrounding herself with the scent of herbs, she was building a fragrant fortress. She believed that if she could smell the lavender over the scent of her own unwashed skin, the plague couldn't find her. Scent was a medical shield. In the Great Hall, Eleanor's evening grooming is more sophisticated. She might use rose water imported from the East, or musk from the glands of a deer. She douses herself in these heavy, cloying scents. The result is a sensory overload, a mix of expensive perfume, stale sweat, and the smell of the beeswax candles. It was an atmosphere so thick you could almost taste it. Now, what about the nobility? Did they never take those Hollywood baths? Occasionally, yes. But for Eleanor, a bath was a major logistics operation. It required a massive wooden tub lined with linen so the lady wouldn't get a splinter. It required dozens of buckets of water carried up from the castle well. It required hours of heating that water over a massive fire. Because a bath was so rare and so expensive, it became a social event. Eleanor might have her ladies-in-waiting read to her, or play music while she soaked. She might even eat a meal on a small board placed across the tub. It was bath theater. But even then, she was cautious. She would wear a thin shift in the water to maintain her modesty, and she wouldn't stay in long enough to wrinkle, which she feared was the beginning of her skin dissolving. Think about your grooming tonight. You stand under a pressurized stream of hot, purified water. You use 5 different products for your hair and skin. You feel clean the moment the water hits you. Now look at Alis. She is standing in the dark, shivering, rubbing her skin with a dry rag until it burns. She feels clean because she has removed the visible grit, even if the deep dirt remains. Her grooming is an act of endurance. Yours is an act of luxury. We have externalized our cleanliness to the plumbing. She internalized it through effort. We wash away the day. She scraped it off. As Alice finishes her rub and braids her hair for the night, she looks in a small warped piece of polished metal. She isn't looking for flaws. She is looking for signs of health. Is her skin clear? Are her eyes bright? In the Middle Ages, physical appearance was seen as a direct reflection of spiritual health. A blemish wasn't just a pimple. It was a sign of bad humors or an unclean soul. Her evening grooming was a ritual of spiritual alignment. By cleaning her face and hands, she was preparing her temple for the presence of God during her prayers. Finally, she is as clean as 1,350 allows her to be. Her skin is pink from the linen, her hair is braided tight against her head, and she smells of dry lavender and wood smoke. The grooming is over, but as she prepares to climb into her bed, she knows that she is not entering a private sanctuary. In the Middle Ages, the night was not solitary. The bed was a shared geography, a place where bodies collided, secrets were whispered, and the most intimate parts of life were managed in the dark. What was the medieval bed actually like? Who did Alice share it with? And why was privacy the most expensive luxury in the world? It's time to talk about intimacy and the shared bed. Close your eyes and think of your bed. It is your sanctuary, a private kingdom of memory foam, high thread count cotton, and white noise. You close the door, and the world disappears. You are alone. Now look at Alice in her 14th century cottage. For her, the bed is not a sanctuary of solitude. It is a crowded geography. It is the only warm place in a frozen world. In the year 1350, privacy was a concept as foreign as a trip to the moon. To be a woman in the medieval evening was to live, breathe, and sleep in constant physical contact with others. As she climbs onto her straw-stuffed pallet, she isn't just seeking rest. She is joining a collective huddle for survival. If you are poor, your bed is a wooden frame filled with straw, or simply a pile of dried rushes in a corner of the main room. It smells of dust, old grain, and the sharp tang of the hearth smoke. But Alice doesn't sleep alone. Beside her is her husband. Tucked between them or at their feet are their 3 children. And in the corner of the same bed, perhaps a traveling cousin, a neighbor whose roof failed, or even a servant. This was the great shared bed. In the Middle Ages, the more bodies in a bed, the better your chances of seeing the sunrise without frostbitten toes. Imagine the sensory overload. You are surrounded by the smells of unwashed wool, stale sweat, and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of 5 different people. You feel every twitch, every cough, every dream shiver of those around you. Your personal space is exactly the width of your own shoulders. This constant physical intimacy created a psychological bond we can barely imagine. You didn't just know your family. You knew the architecture of their rib cages and the exact cadence of their snores. Now, contrast this with Eleanor in the castle. She has a great bed, a massive structure of carved oak that cost more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. It has a feather mattress so deep you sink into it like a cloud. But does Eleanor have privacy? Not a bit. Even in the castle, the bed was a social stage. Eleanor's bed has heavy velvet curtains. In the evening, as she retires, these curtains are drawn shut. This created a room within a room, the only place in the entire fortress where she could truly speak in a whisper without being overheard by the guards at the door. But inside those curtains, it isn't just Eleanor and her husband. Often, a lady-in-waiting would sleep on a small trundle bed pulled out from beneath the main frame, or a young page might sleep on a rug at the foot of the bed. Even for a lady, the night was a shared performance. The curtains didn't hide you from the world, they just filtered the world into a smaller, more intense circle of observers. Because the day was so loud and so public, the shared bed became the only place for the secret voice. In the absolute blackness of the evening, when the rest of the household was a chorus of snores, Alice and her husband would talk. This was pillow diplomacy. In these whispered conversations, the real decisions of the medieval world were made. Alice would lean close to her husband's ear, her breath warm against his skin. They would discuss the manor lord's demands, the health of the plow ox, the marriage prospects of their daughter. This was where a woman's soft power was at its most potent. In the dark, without the village elders watching, Alice could be her husband's most trusted advisor. She could use her wit, her intuition, and her secrets gathered from the herbwife or the spinning circle to shape their family's future. The bed wasn't just for sleep, it was the situation room of the household. We must talk about the other reality of the shared bed: intimacy. The church called it the marital debt. For a woman in 1350, her body was a vessel for the family's legacy. She was expected to submit to her husband's desires as an act of Christian duty. But imagine the reality. You are in a bed shared with children and relatives. The act of love was a silent, hurried, and often awkward struggle in the dark, muffled by heavy blankets and the fear of waking the little ones. There was no romance in the way we understand it today. It was a mechanical necessity, often fraught with the looming shadow of the next pregnancy, a pregnancy that, in the Middle Ages, carried a 1 in 3 chance of death. For many women, the evening in the shared bed was a time of intense anxiety. Every touch from a husband was a gamble with her life. She would lie awake afterward, listening to the wind in the thatch, praying to Saint Margaret to keep her womb closed or her labor easy. The shared bed was a place of deep, silent terror as much as it was a place of warmth. How did they do it? How did people live so closely without going mad? They had a bedside etiquette that was strictly enforced. You didn't move suddenly. You didn't hog the covers. You maintained a spiritual distance, even when your skin was touching. In larger communal settings, like an inn or a noble's barracks, guests were expected to lie head to toe or, like sardines, to maximize space. There was a profound sense of social trust. To sleep beside someone was to offer them your life. You were vulnerable, unclothed, and unconscious. This nightly shared vulnerability created a social glue that held medieval society together. We lock our doors to feel safe. They huddled together. Think about our modern sleep hygiene. We are told that sleeping in separate beds, or even separate rooms, can save a marriage. We value uninterrupted sleep above all else. We have sleep trackers that tell us exactly how many minutes we spent in REM. Now, look at Alice. Her sleep tracker is the kick of a child in her ribs or the weight of her husband's arm. She doesn't have uninterrupted sleep. She has communal rest. We have gained silence, but we have lost the biological safety of the huddle. We are the first humans in history to sleep alone, and we wonder why we feel so anxious in the dark. For Alice, the sound of 5 other people breathing was the ultimate lullaby. It meant everyone was still alive. It meant the demons couldn't pick her off one by one. As the household settles into the deep night, the dreams begin. In the Middle Ages, dreams weren't just brain firings, they were messages. Because the air was thick with the smoke of the perpetual stew and the fumes of the tallow, and often the hallucinogenic ergot fungus in the bread, medieval dreams were vivid, terrifying, and profound. Alice would dream of saints in golden armor. She would dream of the dance of death in the village square. She would dream of the babies she had lost, their faces clear and bright in the landscape of her mind. In the morning, these dreams would be shared. The morning talk in the bed was a communal decoding of the night's messages, but for the woman, sleep was always shallow. She was the perpetual watcher. Every time a child whimpered, she was awake. Every time the fire crackled too loudly, she was alert. She lived in a state of half-rest, her ears tuned to the frequency of her family's survival. As she lies there, pinned between the bodies of those she loves, she feels the weight of her responsibility. She is the anchor. She is the one who holds this little island of warmth together in the vast, cold ocean of the 14th century. But there is one sound she fears more than any other: the sound of a breath that stops, or a breath that becomes a ragged, wet rattle. In the shared bed, you don't just share warmth, you share sickness. And for the medieval woman, the night was often a countdown. What happens when the huddle isn't enough to keep the cold out of a child's lungs? What happens when the morning comes and the island in the dark has lost one of its residents? It's time to talk about the most heartbreaking ritual of the medieval evening: the guards of the cradle. In the 21st century, the nursery is a fortress of technology. You have high-definition cameras with night vision, sensors that track a baby's every movement, and apps that alert you if a breath is missed. You have vaccines, antibiotics, and sterile environments. You have control. Now, look at Alice in 1350. She is kneeling by a small, hand-carved wooden cradle. In the year 1350, a baby's life is as flickering and uncertain as the flame of a tallow rushlight. 1 in 3 children will not see their 5th birthday. In the evening, when the house goes still and the light dies, the cradle becomes the most dangerous place in the world. For a medieval woman, the night is a long, desperate vigil, a time when she stands as the only guard between her child and the shadow thieves of death. To Alice, the danger isn't just germs or bacteria, words that don't exist in her vocabulary. The danger is spiritual. She believes that in the darkness, the changelings are waiting. These are the fairy spirits who slip into homes to steal a healthy human child and replace it with a sickly, withered creature of their own. She fears the evil eye cast by a jealous neighbor. She fears the night hags that suck the breath from small lungs. She fears the unbaptized spirits who wander the lanes looking for company. To us, this sounds like folklore. To her, it is a medical emergency that happens every single night. Her evening is a ritual of spiritual armoring. She isn't just tucking her baby in, she is fortifying a soul. If you reached under the thin wool blanket of that medieval cradle, your fingers would find the shadow shields. Alice has placed a small silver coin, if she could ever afford one, beneath the baby's head. Silver is the metal of purity, believed to repel the touch of the other world. Beside the coin, she tucks a small, hard crust of holy bread, bread that was blessed during the Sunday Mass. To her, this isn't just grain, it's a physical fragment of divine protection. She might even sprinkle a few drops of holy water, kept in a small clay vial, onto the 4 corners of the cradle. She is building a sanctified zone. She believes that if she creates enough of a spiritual barrier, the demons will pass her door and find an easier target. It is a mother's desperate attempt to bargain with the universe using a bit of metal and a scrap of bread. But Alice doesn't just rely on charms. Her body is tuned to the frequency of that cradle. In the shared bed we discussed, she is the first to wake. She listens for the wet rattle, the sound of fluid in the lungs, the croup or the great cough that could take a child by morning. In the absolute blackness of the evening, she leans over the cradle. She doesn't have a thermometer. She presses her lips to the baby's forehead, judging the heat of the blood. She smells the baby's breath, looking for the sweet scent of health or the sour tang of the rot. If the baby is hot, she doesn't reach for ibuprofen. She reaches for her herb wife secrets. She might rub the child's chest with rendered goose fat and mustard, or wrap a poultice of bruised onions around the tiny feet. She does this by touch, her hands moving with a practiced, terrified grace in the dark. She is a doctor, a nurse, and a priestess, all while her own body screams for sleep. Every mother in the 14th century carries a ghost gallery in her heart. Alice has likely lost a child already. Perhaps a son who died of the sweating sickness, or a daughter who simply stopped breathing one cold November night. In the deep evening, when she is alone with the cradle, these ghosts return. She wonders what she did wrong. Did she forget to cross the hearth? Did she look at the moon through glass? The weight of maternal guilt in the Middle Ages was crushing. Without a scientific understanding of SIDS or infection, every death was seen as a failure of protection. She believes she is a guard who failed her post. As she watches her living child breathe, she is also mourning the ones she couldn't save. The night is her time for a silent, lonely grief that the busy, brutal labor of the day doesn't allow. Think about the owlet sock or the snooze monitor today. You feel safe because a computer is watching your baby's heart rate. You can sleep because the technology guarantees an alarm. Now look at Alice. Her sensor is her own skin. Her alarm is her own intuition. She can never truly sleep. She lives in a state of hypervigilance that lasts for years. We have outsourced our anxiety to the silicon chip. She carried her anxiety in her marrow. We track our babies. She interceded for hers. Our nights are interrupted by push notifications. Hers were interrupted by the angel of death. The most urgent ritual of the medieval evening was the night baptism. If a baby was born weak or fell suddenly ill in the late hours, Alice knew she had only minutes. In 1350, an unbaptized child could not enter heaven. They would wander in limbo, the borderland of shadows, forever. If the priest couldn't be reached, Alice herself, or any woman present, could perform the emergency baptism. In the flickering light of a single tallow rush, she would pour a bit of water over the child's head, reciting the Latin words she had memorized like a survival code. I baptize thee in the name of the Father. This was the only time a woman was officially allowed to perform a sacrament of the Church. In the face of death, her spiritual authority was finally, briefly recognized. She was the one who could open the gates of paradise for her child when the men were too far away. As the night reaches its deepest point, Alice might finally sit on the floor beside the cradle, her head resting against the wood. She listens to the rhythmic hiss-hush of the baby's breath. To her, this is the most beautiful sound in the world. It is the sound of a victory. She knows that by dawn, the shadow thieves will retreat. The sun will return, and the immediate danger will pass. But for tonight, she stays at her post. She is the guard of the cradle, the watcher in the dark, the shield maiden of the nursery. Finally, the first cock crow echoes from the barn. The gray light of 4 a.m. begins to bleed through the shutters. Alice reaches out and touches the baby's hand. It is warm. It is moving. She has won another night. She has held the line for another 16 hours of darkness. She rises, her joints stiff and her eyes burning, and moves to the hearth to start the fire. The cradle watch is over, and the labor of the day begins. But as she blows on the embers to start the morning fire, she looks out the window at the frost on the grass. She knows that her battle with the night is about to get much, much harder, because the calendar is turning. The mild nights of autumn are fading, and the great winter is coming. A time when the darkness lasts for 18 hours, and the cold becomes a physical enemy that can freeze a pot of pottage solid on the hearth. How did a medieval woman survive a night that lasted twice as long as the day? What happens to the human mind when the sun disappears for months on end? And what were the winter secrets that kept families from going mad in the great dark? It's time to talk about the changing seasons. In the year 1350, the sun is not just a light, it is a tyrant. It dictates every heartbeat of the medieval village. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to be a slave to the golden ratio of the seasons. There were no standard work hours. There were no time zones. There was only the lengthening and shortening of the shadows. As Alice stands at her cottage door, she feels the seasons in her marrow. She knows that the evening she experienced in June, bright, frantic, and exhausting, is a world away from the evening that awaits her in December. In the Middle Ages, the night wasn't a constant, it was a shapeshifter. And as the calendar turns, Alice must transform her rituals, her labor, and her very spirit to survive the great shift. Imagine it is mid-June. The sun doesn't set until nearly 10 p.m. In the 21st century, we call this leisure time. We have barbecues and long walks in the park. For Alice, the summer night is a curse of labor. Because the light lasts so long, the work never stops. In the evening, when the heat of the day finally breaks, Alice is in the fields. She is gleaning, following the harvesters to pick up every stray ear of wheat. She is weeding the garden by the pale light. She is hauling water while the moon is already visible in the sky. There is no evening rest. Her night is reduced to a frantic 4 or 5 hours of shallow sleep before the sun screams back over the horizon at 4 a.m. In the summer, the medieval woman is a ghost of exhaustion. Her evening is a blur of sweat, green stalks, and the desperate race to store enough calories before the king turns his back on her. The summer night isn't dark, it's just a shorter version of the day. But now, watch the shadows grow. October bleeds into November. The sun, once so generous, becomes stingy. By December, the sun is a distant, cold memory that disappears by 3:30 in the afternoon. Welcome to the great dark. For Alice, the evening is no longer a segment of her day. It is her day. She is facing 18 hours of pitch-black, bone-chilling night. This was the true test of the medieval psyche. Imagine living in a world where the sun is gone for twice as long as it is present. The house becomes a fortress. The evening ritual expands to fill the void. This is when the perpetual spinning we discussed becomes a form of sanity. In the winter dark, the rhythm of the wheel is the only thing that proves time is still moving. Without it, the silence of the winter night, heavy with the threat of wolves and the bite of the frost, could drive a person to madness. Modern psychologists talk about seasonal affective disorder, SAD. For the medieval woman, this wasn't a disorder, it was a collective reality. The lack of vitamin D, the constant cold, and the relentless gloom created a heaviness of the soul. In the long winter evenings, the demons in the corners feel more real. The grief over lost children feels sharper. The fear of the empty grain bin feels louder. To combat this winter melancholy, women turned to storytelling diplomacy. They gathered closer to the hearth, their shoulders touching. They shared winter tales, long, sprawling sagas of heroes who traveled to the sun, or of saints who brought fire to the frozen. These weren't just stories, they were light therapy. They were using words to color a world that had turned gray and black. The evening became a theater of the imagination, the only place where the sun still shone. The climax of the winter night was the solstice, the shortest day and longest night. In 1350, this wasn't just a calendar event, it was a cosmic crisis. There was a deep, primal fear that this time, the sun might not come back, that the great dark might be permanent. In the evening of the solstice, Alice and her neighbors performed the ritual of the need fire. They would extinguish every hearth in the village. The world went totally, terrifyingly black. Then, using ancient friction methods, wood rubbing on wood, they would birth a new fire. This was the living light. They would carry sparks from this communal fire back to their own hearths. It was a ritual of hope engineering. By lighting their homes with the new fire, they were commanding the sun to return. The evening was a night of vigil, of singing, and of Yule log burning, a massive piece of oak that had to stay burning for 12 nights to ward off the wild hunt of spirits. But there was a grim practical side to the winter night. Fuel. In the Great Shift, the demand for wood doubled, but the ability to gather it disappeared under the snow. Alice becomes a heat accountant. In the winter evening, she makes brutal decisions. Do we burn the last oak log tonight, or do we shiver and save it for the January deep freeze? She moves the livestock even closer. She stuffs the gaps in the walls with more dried moss. The smell of the winter night is the smell of cold stone, that mineral, damp scent that tells you the earth is trying to reclaim your home. The evening is spent in a state of hibernation light. To move is to burn calories. To burn calories is to need more food. So, they sit, they spin, they wait. The medieval evening in winter is a lesson in the power of stillness. Think about your life today. You have oranges in January. You have air conditioning in July. You have full-spectrum light bulbs that trick your brain into thinking it's high noon at midnight. You live a seasonless life. Now, look at Alice. Her life is a pulse. She expands in the summer and contracts in the winter. She is in sync with the planet in a way that is both beautiful and terrifying. She knows the taste of the December air and the weight of the June light. We have gained consistency, but we have lost the poetry of the shift. We have climate control. She had climate submission. And then, the miracle happens. One February evening, Alice steps out and smells it. Not the rot of the pantry, not the smoke of the hearth, but the green scent of the thawing earth. The sun stays for an extra 10 minutes. The great dark is breaking. The evening rituals shift again. The night vigil becomes a seed watch. The prayers change from mercy to fertility. The medieval woman is the first to notice the return of the light. She is the herald of the sun. As Alice watches the first spring stars appear in a sky that is no longer pitch black by 4 p.m., she feels a sense of weary triumph. She has survived another cycle. The fire, the fat, the fiber, the faith. They have carried her through. But as we look at her standing there, a silhouette against the rising moon of 1350, we have to ask, what did it all mean? What is the legacy of these millions of women who spent their nights in the dark, building our world one stitch and one prayer at a time? It's time for the final chapter. It's time to talk about the legacy of the shadows. What remains of Alice's night in your evening tonight? The year is 2026. You sit in your room, and for you, the night has been defeated. You have conquered the darkness with LEDs, fiber optics, and 24-hour convenience. You have killed the shadows. But as we stand at the end of this journey through the medieval evening, we must ask, in winning the war against the night, what did we lose? We have traded the great silence for the digital noise. We have traded the huddle of survival for the isolation of privacy. We have gained the world at our fingertips, but we have lost the world beneath our feet. Look at your hands. You may not hold a distaff, and you may not be stained with the soot of a peat fire, but the blood that flows through your veins belongs to Alice. It belongs to Eleanor. It belongs to the herb wife and the shadow scholar. You are the living legacy of millions of women who survived the impossible. Every time you feel a surge of intuition in the dark, that is Alice's night vision echoing in your DNA. Every time you find the strength to guard a loved one through a feverish night, you are standing a watch that was perfected in a 14th century cottage. Their labor wasn't just about spinning wool or baking bread. It was about endurance engineering. They built the foundation of our world in the pitch black, one prayer and one stitch at a time. We live in a seasonless era, yet we are lonelier than the woman who shared her bed with 5 people and a goat. We have smart homes, but we have forgotten how to listen to the voices of the house. The medieval woman knew the poetry of scarcity. She knew that a single tallow rush was precious because it was limited. She knew that a shared story was a lifeline because the silence was absolute. Their legacy isn't found in stone monuments or history books written by kings. It is found in the way we still seek a hearth, even if that hearth is now a glowing TV screen. It is found in our collective hunger for hygiene, for cozy, for a return to the small circle of warmth. We are still, at our core, creatures of the firelight. As the sun sets tonight, I want you to do something radical. Don't flick the switch immediately. Sit in the gray hour for just 5 minutes. Listen to the house settle. Feel the weight of the air. Remember the women who lived their entire lives in that space, who found joy, power, and wisdom in the shadows. The great dark of 1350 is gone, but the spirit of the guardians of the night remains. You are their dream of a bright future. Don't let their silence be forgotten. If this journey through the medieval night has touched something deep within you, if it has made you look at your own evening differently, then I invite you to join our circle. Subscribe to this channel to uncover more forgotten stories of the human spirit. I genuinely want to know, where are you watching from right now, and what does your hearth look like in the modern world? Is it a candle, a family dinner, or a quiet moment alone? Drop a comment below. I read every single one, and your words keep the fire of these stories burning. The night is coming. Bank your fire. Guard your soul. And remember, the shadows always have a story to tell.